The first time you hear a Nate Dogg hook, you don't just hear music, you remember exactly where you were. Maybe you were leaning against a car door with the windows rolled down, feeling the humid air of a summer evening. Maybe you were listening to a cracked radio in a crowded apartment where the walls seemed to vibrate with the bass. Or maybe it was one of those late nights when the world felt significantly heavier than usual, and you needed a reason to believe that everything was going to be all right. In those moments, Nate's voice didn't just play, it intervened. It made everything feel steady, almost safe. It was as if the West Coast had its own biological heartbeat, and Nathaniel Hale was the one keeping the time. In the modern landscape of hip-hop, people love to argue. They sit in barbershops and online forums debating who the new king of hooks is, who carries the torch for the melodic sound, or who might be the next in line to claim the throne. But every time that debate reaches a fever pitch, a sudden truth stands in the room like a shadow you simply cannot ignore. There was only one Nate Dogg, and the cold, hard reality of the music industry is that there will never, ever be another. He was far more than just a featured artist. He was the sonic architect of an entire era. Nate Dogg was the golden thread that stitched together the raw, jagged edges of gangsta rap with the smooth, soulful textures of R&B. He was the calm under the chaos, the melodic anchor in a sea of lyrical violence. When a track was too aggressive, he softened it. When it was too hollow, he gave it weight. He provided the spiritual balance that allowed the West Coast to conquer the global airwaves. But that voice, that legendary velvet-smooth baritone, did not come from a place of Hollywood polish or studio-manufactured perfection. It didn't emerge from a talent agency or a reality TV show. It came from a much deeper, more complicated source. It was a voice raised in the wooden pews of Mississippi churches, shaped by the ancient rhythms of gospel hymns, and later hardened by the concrete sun of Long Beach, California. It was a talent that seemed almost too natural to be taught, a gift that bypassed the intellect and went straight for the soul. Nate didn't just sing lyrics, he sang truths. He brought a sense of church-like reverence to the most secular of stories, making the life of the streets feel like a holy epic. This is not just a standard biography of a singer who had a few hits. This is the chronicle of a man who became the literal soul of West Coast hip-hop. This is the story of Nathaniel Hale, a man who walked the line between the choir loft and the street corner, and in doing so, changed the frequency of popular music forever. To understand the music, you have to understand the man. And to understand the man, we have to go back to the beginning, to the red clay of Mississippi, and the hymns that first taught a young boy how to make the world listen. Before the world knew him as Nate Dogg, before the platinum hooks and the global fame, before the entire weight of the West Coast's melodic soul rested on his shoulders, he was simply Nathaniel Hale. He was a quiet, observant boy born on August 19, 1969, in Clarksdale, Mississippi, the heart of the Delta, a place where the soil is rich with the history of the blues and the air is thick with the resonance of the gospel. In Clarksdale, the church was not just a weekend destination, it was the center of the universe. For young Nathaniel, the church was his first classroom and his first stage. His father, Daniel Lee Hale, was a powerful pastor, and his mother, Ruth Holmes, led the children's choir with an iron hand and a golden ear. The Hale household was a place governed by hymns where music was not a hobby, but a form of breathing. By the age of 6, Nate was already standing in those wooden pews, filling the rafters with a voice that sounded decades older than his small frame suggested. As part of the Hale family gospel group, he traveled from one small, dusty church to another across the South. It was here that he learned the most important lesson of his career: how to move a crowd without shouting. He learned the power of the low end, the way a steady, vibrating baritone could settle an audience's spirit and command their attention. Even then, before the world hardened him, his voice carried a unique texture, a blend of divine gentleness and an ancient, earthy sorrow. But childhood is rarely a straight line of peace. When Nate was 14, the foundation of his world cracked. His parents' marriage collapsed, and the resulting fallout sent a shockwave through his life. His mother made the pivotal decision to pack up the family and US trading the red clay of Mississippi for the sun-drenched concrete labyrinth of Long Beach, California. This move wasn't just a change of scenery. It was a collision with a new reality. Long Beach in the 1980s was a beautiful, dangerous contradiction. It was a place where the palm trees swayed over neighborhoods gripped by the crack epidemic and escalating gang warfare. It was here at Long Beach Polytechnic High School that destiny began to take shape. Nate walked those hallways alongside two other boys who were searching for their own escape routes: Calvin Broadus, who would become Snoop Dogg, and Warren Griffin, the younger brother of Dr. Dre, who the world would know as Warren G. At school, Snoop was the undisputed king of the freestyle, possessed of a natural, effortless flow that made other rappers sound like they were trying too hard. Warren G was the quiet architect, always listening to the inner workings of a beat. But Nate was different. He didn't rap. He was a creature of the church of harmony and structure. When he finally opened his mouth to sing for his friends, the reaction was immediate. He didn't have the high-pitched, sugary polish of a typical R&B singer. He had a weight. He brought the gravity of a Mississippi pastor to the swagger of a Long Beach teenager. They became inseparable, a brotherhood forged in football games, shared snacks, and the constant looming threat of the streets. They called themselves 213, named after the LA area code of the time. But just as their creative chemistry was bubbling, the pressure of his environment pushed Nate in a different direction. At 17, desperate for structure and a way to support himself, he dropped out of school and joined the United States Marine Corps. For 3 years, Nate served as an ammunition specialist in Okinawa, Japan. He wanted the discipline. He wanted to see if he could belong to something bigger than the block. But the rigid, unyielding nature of the military eventually clashed with the restless storm he carried inside. He struggled with the authority of the service, leading to a series of unauthorized absences as he felt the pull of home and the pull of the music. When he was finally discharged and returned to Long Beach, he found a city that had grown even colder. Work was scarce. The 213 dream seemed like a lifetime ago. To survive, Nate drifted into the shadows of the street, a path that eventually led to a robbery charge and a brush with the prison system. He was a man at a crossroads, a gifted singer with a Marine's discipline and a hustler's desperation. It was in this moment of absolute uncertainty that he reconnected with Snoop and Warren G. They were all broke, they were all struggling, and they were all ready to bet everything on a homemade tape. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to build an empire. Every revolution has a catalyst, a single moment where the stars align and the world changes frequency. For Nate Dogg, Snoop and Warren G, that moment didn't happen in a high-rise executive office. It happened in the middle of a party. Warren G, desperate to get their sound heard, slipped a homemade 213 demo tape into the sound system at a party hosted by his half-brother, Dr. Dre. The room was filled with the elite of the LA scene, but as Nate's voice emerged through the speakers, deep, smooth, and chillingly confident, the atmosphere shifted. People stopped talking. The drink cups stayed midair. Dre, the architect of NWA, looked up and asked the 3 words that would launch 1,000 hits. Who is that? That question was the key to a kingdom. Dre summoned Snoop to the studio to begin work on a project that would redefine music history, The Chronic. But while Snoop provided the charismatic flow, Nate Dogg provided the soul. When he stepped into the booth to record tracks like D's Newts and Lil Ghetto Boy, he wasn't just a background singer. He was the anchor. He brought a church-like gravity to the rawness of the lyrics, making the street life feel monumental, almost biblical. The Chronic went triple platinum, shifting the center of the hip-hop universe to the West Coast. And when it came time for Snoop's debut, Doggy Style, Nate was the secret weapon once again. His performance on Ain't No Fun If the Homies Can't Have None became a cultural phenomenon. It was a song that played in every car, every club, and every backyard. Baby Q from Long Beach to London. Nate didn't just sing a hook. He stamped the entire era with his authority. He proved that you could be a gangster and still have a melody. But the world truly stood still in 1994, when Warren G asked Nate to collaborate on a single for the Above the Rim soundtrack. The result was Regulate. From the moment Nate's baritone opened the track, 16 in the clip and 1 in the hole, it was clear this wasn't just a hit. It was a scripture of the streets. It felt like a movie, a conversation, and a prayer all at once. Regulate climbed to number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 and earned a Grammy nomination, cementing Nate Dogg as the undisputed king of hooks. He had achieved what every artist dreams of: a signature sound that was instantly recognizable and impossible to replicate. However, as his voice was lifting everyone else to the top of the charts, the chains of industry politics began to tighten around him. While he was the soul of the movement, Nate was signed to Death Row Records, an empire built on brilliance, but ruled by fear and intimidation. Suge Knight recognized Nate's value, but he treated him like a valuable piece of property rather than a human being. While artists like Snoop Dre and Tupac were releasing multi-platinum solo albums, Nate was kept in the shadows. He sang on hit after hit, carried the weight of every chorus that became a cultural anchor. Yet for years, Death Row refused to release his solo debut. He was the voice that everyone heard, but the man that the machine kept quiet. The irony was devastating. At a time when he was one of the most famous voices on the planet, Nate was often broke, caught in the web of unfair contracts and legal battles. He was the man who made everyone else a millionaire, while he struggled to find his own footing. There are stories from this era that paint a bleak picture of his reality. Stories of a man so desperate for money that he allegedly resorted to robbing a Taco Bell, an act that stood in staggering contrast to his status as a global icon. Nate Dogg was the bridge between R&B and gangsta rap, the voice that made the hardest lyrics go down smooth. He was irreplaceable, essential, and legendary. But as the 90s marched on, the pressure of being the silent pillar of an empire began to take its toll. He had climbed from the gospel pews to the center of a cultural revolution. But he was starting to realize that in the music business, sometimes the most beautiful voice is the one they try the hardest to control. Success is a deceptive mirror. It reflects the glory the world wants to see while blurring the cracks forming beneath the surface. For Nate Dogg, the late 90s and early 2000s were a period of staggering professional height and devastating personal depth. While he was appearing on every major hip-hop anthem from Dr. Dre's Next Episode to Eminem's Shake That, the man behind the microphone was wrestling with a reality that no amount of gold records could fix. The legal system became a recurring character in Nate's life, a long shadow that followed him from the studio to the courtroom. There were arrests for assault accusations of domestic violence and charges involving illegal weapons and kidnapping. To the media, he was becoming a caricature of the gangster he sang about. But for those who knew Nathaniel Hale, the truth was far more fragile. He was a man trying to navigate a world of extreme wealth while still carrying the survival instincts of a boy from Long Beach. He was trapped in a cycle where the streets demanded his loyalty and the law demanded his soul. Behind the scenes, Nate battled a darkness that few dared to talk about. Friends and collaborators noticed a shift in his personality, a secondary identity they called buddy love. When Nate was sober, he was the quiet, church-trained gentleman, the man who would pray before a session. But when the cognac began to flow, buddy love would emerge. This version of Nate was volatile, unpredictable, and possessed a temper sharp enough to silence any room. The heavy drinking wasn't just a habit. It was a numbing agent for the trauma of his past and the suffocating pressure of an industry that used his voice but rarely protected his interests. Despite being the most sought-after hook man in the world, Nate's financial situation remained a constant struggle. The predatory contracts of the death row era had left him with massive debts and little control over his own royalties. It is a haunting irony that the man who gave the West Coast its signature soul often felt like he was losing his own. He was the bridge between the streets and the stars, yet he often found himself standing on that bridge alone, watching others cross into the lifestyle he had helped build. His personal relationships suffered under the weight of this chaos. He was a father to several children, but the turbulence of his lifestyle made consistency a luxury he could rarely afford. He moved through life like a man who knew his time was limited, driven by an urgency that often manifested as aggression. Yet even in his darkest moments, the music remained his only sanctuary. In the recording booth, the buddy love persona vanished. The drinking stopped. The anger cooled. Under the glow of the studio lights, he became the calm, melodic anchor once again. It was as if the microphone was the only place where Nate Dogg could finally be Nathaniel Hale, the boy from the Mississippi pews who believed in harmony. But as the millennium turned, the toll of this double life began to manifest physically. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget, and for Nate, the years of high-octane stress, legal battles, and substance use were silently preparing to strike. He was a legend in motion, a man whose name guaranteed a hit, but he was also a man running out of breath. The shadows were no longer just following him. They were starting to close in. For every soaring height a human being reaches, there is often a breaking point that the world never sees coming until it is too late to look away. For Nate Dogg, that point arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet accumulated weight of the streets, the suffocating pressure of an unforgiving industry, and the long-term consequences of choices made in the heat of his youth. Fame can open every door in the world, and it can offer a temporary shield against the elements, but it cannot hide the biological damage happening behind the scenes when a man's body finally begins to rebel against his relentless will. In 2007, fate struck with a brutal physical force that should have been a final warning. Nate and his girlfriend were involved in a car accident so severe that their vehicle flipped multiple times, crashing into the earth with a violence that left him with internal bleeding and a head wound so deep it required surgical staples to close. In the sterile white light of the emergency room, doctors urged him to stay. They warned him that his body was at its absolute limit, and that rest was no longer a luxury. It was a requirement for his very survival. But Nate, driven by the same restless, stubborn urgency that had pushed him through every struggle from Long Beach to the Marines, refused to listen. He checked himself out of the hospital almost immediately, fueled by adrenaline and a misguided sense of duty. He had a show to perform in Las Vegas, and in his mind, the music could never stop, no matter the cost. But the human body is not an infinite resource, and the mind can only endure so much chaos before the foundation begins to crumble. Not long after that Vegas performance, Nate suffered his first stroke. It was a terrifying systemic blow that weakened the entire left side of his body. For a man who was left-handed, this was a specific, targeted kind of cruelty. It was as if the universe was stripping away his dexterity, his strength, and his ability to move through the world with the swagger he had earned. He tried to push through the recovery with a grim determination, but he did so while continuing to drink heavily, mixing cognac with his medication in a dangerous cocktail that his body could no longer process. Friends who visited him in the hospital were heartbroken to see the king of hooks lying in a bed with a bottle of Hennessy within reach, the only comfort he felt he could still trust when the world grew cold. For a brief flickering period, there was a ghost of hope. He began to talk about a total life transformation, a return to the purity of his roots. He expressed a deep, soulful desire to form a gospel group, wanting to create music that his parents could finally listen to with unmixed pride. There are surviving recordings from this time, haunting tapes of Nate conducting choir rehearsals, offering a glimpse of a man trying desperately to find his way back to the peace of the Mississippi church pews. He wanted to trade the buddy love persona for the Nathaniel Hale who believed in salvation. But the damage inside his brain was deeper than faith alone could mend. In September 2008, the second stroke arrived, and this one was catastrophic. It was a massive final failure that left Nate Dogg paralyzed from the neck down. It stripped him of his ability to walk, and most cruel of all, it stripped him of the very instrument that had defined his existence, his voice. People who visited him in the care facility said the silence in that room was louder than any record he had ever made. The man who had given the world some of its most iconic melodies was now a prisoner in a body that could no longer lift a single note. From that point on, his existence was a quiet, agonizing heartbreak. His days were a blur of physical therapy and mounting medical bills, a slow realization that his world had narrowed into a space from which there was no escape. He fought for nearly 3 years, his spirit flickering in a shell that refused to obey. On March 15, 2011, Nate Dogg passed away at the age of 41. A voice that had bridged the gap between the divine and the street finally fell silent, leaving the world feeling significantly smaller and a lot less soulful than it was before. In the months after Nate Dogg's passing on March 15, 2011, the world struggled to reconcile with the sudden gaping vacuum left in the atmosphere of modern music. For many, the news felt surreal, almost impossible to process, like a fundamental law of nature had been revoked. How could a voice so deeply woven into the very fabric of the West Coast's identity simply vanish? How could the man whose sound served as the undisputed heartbeat for an entire generation be gone at only 41, leaving behind more questions than answers, and a silence far heavier than any song? Across the United States, the reaction was immediate, visceral, and deeply layered. In the barber shops of South Central, on the high-powered radio stations of New York City, and in small living rooms filled with dusty speakers and old CDs, people gathered to talk about the first time they heard that unmistakable baritone. They talked about how his hooks had carried them through bitter breakups, late-night drives through dangerous neighborhoods, and those long golden summers that once seemed like they would never end. For millions of Americans, Nate Dogg wasn't just background noise for the radio. He was a mood. He was a memory. He was a piece of their own survival. The industry titans he had supported for decades spoke up with a grief that felt heavy, unscripted, and rare. Snoop Dogg called him the backbone of his entire career, admitting that without Nate, the melodies of the 213 era would have lacked their soul. Dr. Dre, a man not known for public displays of emotion, remarked that hip-hop had lost its spiritual anchor. Charlie Wilson noted that Nate had brought a level of genuine R&B authenticity to a rap world that desperately needed it. These were not the hollow, polished condolences often seen in Hollywood. They were the somber acknowledgments of a truth the industry had always relied upon, even if it had failed to protect the man who was providing it. Internationally, the mourning took on an even more reflective tone. From the streets of London to the neon districts of Tokyo, fans who had grown up listening to the Chronic and Doggy Style as their gateway to American culture held vigils. They played Regulate on repeat, the lyrics echoing across borders and language barriers, proving that soul knows no geography. It was a staggering realization of just how far Nate's voice had traveled, reaching corners of the globe he had never seen, becoming the essential soundtrack for people who had never once stepped foot in Long Beach. But as the days turned into weeks, a darker, more frustrating reality began to emerge from the shadows of the mourning. The respectful silence of Nate's passing was quickly filled by the loud clashing sounds of legal and financial chaos. The world began to ask difficult, uncomfortable questions. How could a man so globally influential, so essential to the success of multi-platinum empires, die with staggering medical debt and unresolved family conflicts? How could a voice that generated hundreds of millions of dollars for labels and other artists leave behind an estate that became tangled in bitter disputes almost immediately? Accusations, court filings, and ugly arguments over guardianship and inheritance began to overshadow the grieving process. It was a tragic final act for a man who had spent his life creating harmony. The predatory nature of the music business followed him even to the grave, as various parties fought over the rights to his likeness and the future of his royalties. It exposed the cold mechanics of a world that celebrates the art, but often abandons the artist when the music stops. Yet, through all the noise, through all the static of the courtroom battles and the tabloid headlines, one truth remained untouched by the chaos. Nate Dogg had given hip-hop something that belonged to no record label and no legal estate. He had given it a feeling. He had given it a soul. And that gift belonged only to the people who heard him and recognized the profound honesty in every single note he ever sang. The industry could fight over the money, but the streets would always own the memory. Some lives end quietly, fading into the static of history, but the ones that truly matter leave behind something that refuses to grow cold. Nate Dogg's voice did not vanish when he drew his final breath. It simply moved into a different kind of permanence. It remains in the songs that defined the 90s, in the hooks that gave the early 2000s their swagger, and in the private memories of anyone who ever felt grounded by the calm, masculine strength of his tone. To look back at his career is to realize that he didn't just sing songs, he reshaped the very architecture of a genre. He turned the hook from a simple, catchy chorus into a melodic spine, something that held an entire track upright and gave it a sense of purpose. He was the bridge between the sacred and the profane, blending his gospel roots with the unforgiving reality of the streets to create a sound that felt both dangerous and comforting. He gave a generation its soundtrack for every occasion, for the celebrations that lasted until sunrise, for the late-night drives that demanded reflection, and for the grief that words alone could never capture. Without Nathaniel Hale, the West Coast sound would have lacked its heart, and hip-hop would have lacked its most soulful vibration. But his legacy is also a complicated mirror, his personal life marked by legal battles, health struggles, and the heavy toll of fame serves as a poignant reminder that even the artists who seem unshakable are vulnerable to the world's weight. His story is a warning that fame is a fragile shield, and that even the greatest talent requires a foundation of health and peace to survive the storm. For his family, and for the sons who now carry pieces of his unmistakable baritone. In their own music, Nate's life is an inheritance of both immense talent and hard-won truth. If the music industry has a heartbeat, Nate helped set its rhythm. If the West Coast has a soul, his voice is still echoing inside it, pulsing through the speakers of every lowrider and every backyard party from Long Beach to the rest of the world. He was taken from us at 41, far too young, with so many hymns left unsung. But legends are never measured in the number of years they lived. They are measured in the length and depth of their echoes. Nate Dogg still echoes. He echoes in every melodic rapper who tries to find that perfect balance of grit and grace. He echoes in the silence of a studio booth when a producer looks for a sound that can't be found anymore. And he echoes in our hearts every time we hear that deep, smooth opening line that tells us everything is going to be all right. He was the king of hooks, the calm under the chaos, and the man who gave the streets a reason to sing. Rest in peace, Nathaniel Hale. Your work is done, but your song will never truly end.